Hello, welcome to Weekly Talks with June. In my show, on Season 1, Episode 1, we will be exploring the very basics, government in both state and federal positions, and different parts of them, such as the judicial, executive, and legislative branches in each, and where they are currently. In our first segment, we will be looking at the details of the head of government for both Georgia versus the federal government. In each segment, we will be comparing similarities and differences of each, of Georgia versus federal. The head of government obviously is a little bit more specific to the executive branch, but we will get into the executive branch soon. Let's start with Georgia. So currently, the head of government in Georgia is Brian Kemp. He is a Republican, and he is the 83rd governor of Georgia since he was sworn in 2019. The second highest position, or the next person in the line of succession for Georgia governors, would be the Lieutenant Governor, Jeff Duncan. He has served in the Georgia House of Reps from 2013 to 2018. For a person to be qualified as a Georgia governor, they must be at least 30 and a Georgia resident for a minimum of 6 years and a U.S. resident for a minimum of 15. How they elect the Georgia governor, who is the highest position in the government of Georgia, is they take the popular vote by each county and they count those up. Our current governor, Mr. Kemp, ran against Stacey Abrams the year that he was inaugurated was 2019. As for our federal government, we are currently our president of the whole United States, the federal government. The highest position is obviously Mr. Donald Trump. He has been a candidate 3 times and ran in the year 2000. He has much business experience. He is also a Republican, and he also ran this year against Joe Biden, but he is currently still our president, and his vice president, or our current vice president, is Mike Pence, who was Trump's running mate. The qualifications for becoming president of the United States, according to Article 2 of the Constitution, is that the president must be a natural-born citizen of the United States, at least 35, and have been a resident of the states for 14 years. So, similarities between both would include the governor and president are both elected every 4 years. Although they are different years, they're a little staggered. They do serve 4-year terms as the highest position of government. There is a line of succession in both, and currently the positions of these executive members in both the federal government and Georgia government are Republican. And so that concludes our first segment. Welcome back. We will now be comparing the Georgia and federal legislature. It's pretty interesting. I did not know Georgia had its own legislature designated for itself. It actually even has its own constitution. The Georgia legislature is also bicameral. Their numbers are pretty different, though, because in their House of Representatives, there are 180 House members, and there are 56 senators. The reason there are 56 is because there are 56 districts in Georgia, and there's one for each district. As for the House members, to qualify for being one of those, according to the Georgia Constitution, you must be at least 21, a state citizen for 2 years, and a district resident for 1. One particular thing that I noticed is that to be in any position in the federal government versus state government, you must have much more years of experience, you must be much older, and which makes sense, but that was just one thing that did stand out to me. 21 is quite young. I mean, if you think about it, you could technically be in college and be serving in a Georgia state legislature. Members from both houses serve 2-year terms, and now, as for the federal government legislature, there are 435 current House representatives, 100 members in the Senate. To be qualified as a House member, you must be at least 25, citizen for 7+ years, and a state inhabitant. To be a Senate, at least 30 years of age, a U.S. citizen for 9+ years, and residency in your state at election time. Senators in the federal government can be in the legislature for 6 years, but all of their elections are pretty staggered. So really, at any one time, only 1/3 of the Senate is getting reelected. Similarities: both have a bicameral legislature and obviously a constitution, although I'm not sure if it's much of a similarity or difference for that. There are no term limits for either, and bills get passed through both houses. This concludes segment 2. For segment 3, we're going to backtrack a little back to the executive branches, compare and contrast for each. For the Georgia executive branch, we have the governor as the main executive. He possesses great power over the finance. The lieutenant governor, secretary of state, attorney general, school superintendent, commissioners of agriculture, insurance, and labor. Those are all part of the Georgia executive branch. They interact, mainly the governor interacts with other state leaders and, of course, the federal government. And he has the power to be the commander of the Georgia State Patrol and National Guard, much like the federal president has the power to be commander-in-chief of the armed forces. The federal president also has the power to appoint his own cabinet. He is a secretary over many departments and has a line of succession like we had gone over earlier. He signs, rejects, and pardons different bills, and he will veto laws, and he will do negotiations with other nations, much like the Georgia governor will do with other states. We had been over the requirements earlier, but similarities between both is that they have 4-year term limits, no more than 2 consecutive terms. They both have a legislative agenda, initiate budgets, signs, and vetoes bills. I will say that the Georgia government is in a trifecta for being Republican, which means that basically its executive branch and both legislative branches are Republican, so it's pretty deadlocked in being Republican, which is not necessarily the case with the federal government. That concludes segment 3. Last but not least, the judicial branch. Georgia has quite an interesting and rather more complex than I thought it would be judicial branch. According to the 1983 Constitution of Georgia, there are 7 classes of courts and 2 appellate courts. There is a Supreme Court of Georgia and a Court of Appeals in Georgia, and there's the other 5 courts are superior, state, jury, probate, and magistrate. Each of these has a different jurisdiction. For example, the state court has jurisdiction over misdemeanors, and each of these courts have different requirements for their judges. For example, the superior court judges have to be at least 30, a citizen for 3+ years and practiced law for at least 7. Whereas, being a federal court or Supreme Court judge over the whole nation, there are no educational requirements or age requirements or term limits or anything like that. Now back to the state courts. There are courts that actually don't require a jury, and those would be the juvenile courts and the magistrate courts. Magistrate courts are basically courts that deal with smaller claims that are $15,000 or less. And of course, the Supreme Court of Georgia, quite similar to the Supreme Court of the nation, involves and looks at cases involving title to land, equity, wills, habeas corpus, and Court of Appeals. Similarities between each is that they both have specific jurisdictions and different levels of appeals to be able to reach a specific court. And that concludes segment 4. This final segment is over taxes in both state and federal government. Basically, the Georgia Department of Revenue is who handles the Georgia state taxes. There are different forms you will need to fill out, such as a Form 500, Form 500 Easy, and they are obviously specific to where you fall socially. The federal taxes are things you've seen, I'm sure, such as income, payroll, sales tax. So by income, I mean income tax. They're everywhere, and bad consequences if you don't pay out on them. So make sure you guys pay your taxes. And thank you so much for joining me today. I think the biggest thing that we got out of today's info session is that there are lots of similarities between the federal and state governments, and I think that's how they work together best. And it is actually interesting that they're almost the same, except you just need less experience to be in a state government. And for me, I thought it was interesting that the state governments were much more complex than I thought. They had much more levels. For example, the judicial branch had almost 7 courts, and I had no idea that it was that complex. But it's basically like a mini version of the federal government. Thank you to all my viewers, my millions of viewers. This could not be possible without them, and I hope you enjoyed Season 1, Episode 1, my first and last episode. Thank you for all your support. And actually a special thank you or reference to the New Georgia Encyclopedia, because I did find a lot of good information from there. We will see you not soon.